um, to, to investigate the educational implications of neuroscience, and that was back in somewhere in the early 2000s, and that was way ahead of me getting involved in the field. So Daniel is one of my heroes. Daniel is a professor in Canada Research Chair in Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience and Learning at Western University in Ontario in Canada. And he heads up the Numerical Cognition Lab, which explores how children develop numerical and mathematical skills. So I will hand over to Daniel, who's going to tell us about symbolic number development. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be with you all today. Just a little disclaimer: if you did attend the early conference in Thessaloniki in August and you happen to go to my talk, then I yield back an hour to you, because this is essentially the identical talk. But if you weren't there, then hopefully there's something new in here for you. Just like to start by sort of reflecting on how much we use numerical information in our everyday lives to inform our decision making and our behaviors. Wake up in the morning, we typically process numerical information. Most of us don't look at an old-fashioned clock like this, but at our cell phone. But nevertheless, we process numbers. We might go on a trip, and we need lots of numerical information to guide our decision making in travel circumstances. If we check the news, we might check the latest financial indicators and compare them across multiple columns. And we do all of this as literate adults fairly effortlessly. But we also know that mistakes with numbers can have very costly implications. This is a famous Canadian example. This plane is the so-called Gimli glider. It was traveling from Edmonton to Montreal, a 767. But halfway through the journey, the pilots discovered that there was not enough fuel on the plane. And it turns out that the engineers who were fueling the plane in Edmonton had forgotten that Air Canada had recently switched from imperial to metric units, and therefore the plane was only half full. So if we are not conscious about the numerical information that we use in our everyday lives, it can have costly consequences. Given the ubiquitous nature of numbers in our everyday lives, it begs the question how numerical skills develop. And one way to approach this question is to look at what lies at the very foundations of our early numerical abilities. And I think the domain of reading is a real success story, where the focus of foundational competencies has now led to applications in the classroom. Here in Ontario, we're just going through an entirely new language curriculum that is more closely aligned with the science of reading than prior curricula were. So this is where we also can make connections between research and education. We know from work in the domain of reading that children who have solid foundational skills, such as phonological awareness and phonics, go on to experience a developmental trajectory of increasing achievement, whilst those who lack those foundational skills will go on to lag behind. And in fact, the gap between those with and without foundational skills will continue to grow. So there's a real importance for us to also look at this in the case of mathematics, since there's nothing to suggest that there won't be a so-called Matthew effect in early math as well. So what do we know about the foundational competencies underlying our early mathematical abilities? Well, a long line of research now for the past few decades has focused on how we process sets in the world around us, such as this array of dots. And you can look at this array of dots and quickly tell me whether they are more or less than 5. You can compare it to another set of dots, and this so-called non-symbolic number processing ability has received a lot of attention. And it's been demonstrated that we might be born with some sensitivity to numerical quantities, since research with human infants has shown that very young infants are capable of discriminating between dot arrays and also are capable of discriminating between sequences of sounds. So some have even suggested that we are born with an amodal system for the processing of numerical magnitudes. Furthermore, comparative work has revealed in many, many different studies with many different species that non-human primates and other animals are capable of discriminating between non-symbolic numerical magnitudes such as dot arrays. And also that they can be trained on one set of dot arrays. This is work by Liz Brannan, say a range of 1 to 4 and generalized to 5 to 9, suggesting true numerical abilities. And importantly, the psychophysical signature that characterize number discrimination in non-human primates are the same that characterize non-symbolic number processing in humans. When it comes to neuroscience, we've also learned a lot about the neural correlates underlying non-symbolic number processing, all the way from single cell recording in awake behaving primates to functional magnetic resonance imaging studies have consistently pointed to areas in and around the intraparietal sulcus, highlighted here in yellow, as regions that are critical for the processing and representations of numerical quantities. Indeed, it's been suggested that perhaps we're born with some kind of number system in the brain. And this hypothesis stems from cross-sectional work with functional magnetic resonance imaging and EEG source localization, suggesting that in the right hemisphere, in the right intraparietal sulcus, you see sensitivity to changes in non-symbolic number in very young babies and young children, as well as in adults, as nicely illustrated here by this figure taken from Melissa Liberta's and Liz Brannan's review paper some years ago now. But of course, humans differ from other animals in that we have, over the course of cultural history, developed symbolic representations of number. And over the past 6,000 years or so, these have changed dramatically. And nowadays, there is a global use of Hindu-Arabic numerals as a representation, symbolic representation of number. But of course, other representations, symbolic representations of number still exist in various corners of this world. For example, the Chinese ideographs. So there's even nowadays a diversity of numerical symbols in the world, with the Hindu-Arabic numeral system perhaps being the most dominant symbolic number system, which allows us to engage, for example, in financial transactions with individuals in other countries whose language we don't speak. So it's become sort of a universal language of math. But children are not born with a module in their brain for number symbols. This is a cultural representation that needs to be transmitted through informal as well as formal educational activities. This then raises the question of how the innate, sometimes referred to as approximate number system for the processing of non-symbolic numerical quantity, and the acquired symbolic systems are related to one another. And this is sort of falls within a broader research enterprise around how culture and biology interact in the developing mind and in the developing brain. So the case of number can also be used to explore these broader questions around the interaction between perhaps pre-existing innate systems and those that are acquired, that are culture and nature and require human interactions, whether that be through formal or informal education. When we think about the case of the relationship between the non-symbolic, perhaps innate system and the symbolic cultural system, we can posit various ways in which they might be related to one another. Perhaps the most intuitive way of thinking about this relationship is that we are born with a non-symbolic innate system, which then goes on to scaffold a cultural symbolic system, or in other words, that when we learn numerical symbols, we map them onto the pre-existing non-symbolic systems. However, it's also plausible that once we acquire symbolic representations of number through human interactions, that these cultural representations change the way in which we view quantities in the world around us, and therefore changes the non-symbolic representations of numerical quantity. Or it is also possible that the two representations are entirely bidirectionally related, whereby non-symbolic scaffolds symbolic and symbolic changes non-symbolic. So how do we go about finding out which of these accounts, or whether there's maybe two potential models here that could be what is actually going on in human development? Well, what we need is a longitudinal approach. And in order to understand the uni or bidirectional relationships between systems, we need to repeatedly test the same children using the same methods. And that we can then allow that kind of design will then allow for the estimation of the direction of relationships between symbolic and non-symbolic. So a few years ago now, Ian Lyons, who's now an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Georgetown University, and a number of colleagues at the Toronto District School Board, we tested over 500 children who were in senior kindergarten. Senior kindergarten is the final year before the entry into grade 1. At this point in time, children are around 5 years of age. We collected these data from 35 schools in the Toronto District School Board, which is a highly diverse school board. Children were tested in the beginning of their senior kindergarten year, around about September and October, and then again in the spring towards the end of their senior kindergarten year. And we used paper and pencil measures because this was part of a larger effort to design screening tools, and that's where the collaboration with the school board arose. But for the purpose of today, I'm just going to focus on two particular tasks that we use, because these can be used to better understand the developmental dynamics between symbolic and non-symbolic representations of number. On the one hand, the dot comparison task, which measures non-symbolic number processing, where children have to cross out the larger of two dot arrays, and the number comparison task, which measures symbolic number processing, where children have to cross out the numerically larger of the two Hindu-Arabic numerals. So what did we find when we looked at the relationship between these two tasks, between the fall testing time point and the spring testing time point? Well, we used a simple cross-lag panel regression analysis here. So in the beginning of kindergarten and at the end of kindergarten, children were tested on both symbolic and non-symbolic. So in order to, for example, understand whether non-symbolic at time 1 affected symbolic at time 2, we would use non-symbolic at time 1 controlling for the autoregressive effect of symbolic at time 1, and use that to predict individual differences in symbolic at time 2. We also, of course, tested for the reverse, where we would estimate whether symbolic at time 1 controlling for non-symbolic at time 1 affected non-symbolic at time 2. So what we found was that we found no evidence for the hypothesis that non-symbolic at time 1 can predict anything about the change in symbolic between time 1 and time 2. Instead, we found that the reverse was true, that symbolic at time 1 predicted individual differences in non-symbolic at time 2. So these data then suggest that when we think about the relationship between symbolic and non-symbolic, it is not as though the non-symbolic system influences the development of the symbolic system, but rather that the acquisition of symbolic number changes the way in which non-symbolic numerical quantities are processed by children. We then went on together with Nathan Lau, Rebecca Merkley, and various other colleagues to further investigate this hypothesis, because we were able to collect a third time point at the Toronto District School Board when the children were now in grade 1. And in this follow-up study, as I've already said, we had an additional time point, and we used the following tasks. So we added in a mixed comparison task to look also at the sort of translation, if you like, between symbolic and non-symbolic. So in this task, children have to choose whether the dot array or the Arabic numeral is numerically larger. And we also included some simple addition problems here as well. And cross-leg panel models have been criticized because they don't distinguish between within and between subject change. So in this particular study, Nathan introduced us to the random intercept cross-leg panel model, which allows us to better distinguish between within and between subject changes, and better understand whether the relationships we're observing are within subjects or between subjects. So a major advance in that way. And what we did in this study is we postulated 3 different models and fitted these models to the developmental data to understand which model of developmental change best fit our 3 time point data. So the different models that we contrasted is, first of all, the mapping model. So the mapping model essentially posits that non-symbolic influences change in all the other tasks. We also had the refinement model, which posits that symbolic influences changes in all of the other tasks. And then finally, we had a sort of everything affects everything model, which is a fully bidirectional model where non-symbolic influences symbolic, symbolic influences non-symbolic, translating ability influences math, and so forth. And what we found, to cut a long story short, when we asked which model best fit the data, it was consistent with our prior evidence, the refinement model. So the best fitting model was the model in which symbolic drives change in all of these other competencies, be that translating ability, dot comparison, of course, itself, as well as addition. I should say that, of course, the other models did also significantly fit the data, but this was the best fitting model. So we can't say that this is the only developmental dynamic going on, but it's the best account of the developmental data that we have. So these data then suggest that it is not non-symbolic that scaffolds symbolic, but rather the other way around, whereby symbolic influences developmental changes in translating ability, arithmetic, as well as non-symbolic number processing. Now, you might say to me that, well, you tested 5-year-old children, and you told us earlier that even very young babies have numerical competencies. So could it be that initially, much earlier in development, non-symbolic scaffolds symbolic, and once non-symbolic has scaffolded symbolic, there's essentially a reversal in the direction, whereby now symbolic influences non-symbolic? And that, of course, is a very legitimate concern. Thankfully, just last year, Yi Mu and Daniel Hyde's group at UIUC published a paper in Child Development that directly addresses this question. They tested children that were younger than the ones that were included in our prior studies. These children were between 2 and 4 years of age. And they had a one-year longitudinal study with 3 time points. One time point separated by only 2 weeks, and the other, the third time point, approximately a year later. In this study, they measured children's verbal number knowledge, their general cognitive abilities, as well as their ANS, or approximate number system, competencies using a dot comparison task. And what they found is consistent with both Ian's and Nathan's data. This is showing you the results from the 2-week interval. And what you can see very clearly here is that whilst verbal number knowledge at time 1 influences ANS precision at time 2, ANS precision at time 1 does not influence verbal number knowledge at time 2, or does not relate to verbal number knowledge at time 2. When you then look at the longer gap between time point 2 and time point 3, much the same picture emerges, where it's a unidirectional relationship, just like in our data. Verbal number knowledge influences at time 2, influences ANS precision at time 3, but the reverse direction is not significant. So these data seem to suggest that there's quite a convergent body of evidence now to suggest that when we think about the developmental dynamics between symbolic and non-symbolic number processing, perhaps our most intuitive hypothesis that a pre-existing, some people would argue, innate representation of number influences the acquisition of cultural symbolic representations of number, that this is not what is actually going on in the data, but that the data suggests that the reverse is true, that symbolic number knowledge influences non-symbolic from an early age. And we and others believe that symbolic number knowledge may serve as an attentional filter, whereby once you acquire symbolic number knowledge skills, you begin to view sets in the world around you differently. You are able to categorize sets numerically more so than you are in terms of other dimensions, such as their density or their size. And we have some hints already in the literature that this may be true because it's been reported by, for example, Manuela Piazza and Stanislas Dehaene, but also by other researchers, that developmental changes in non-symbolic number processing do not reflect changes in the precision of the underlying representation, but more changes in the way in which children access these representations. So we argue that this increasing ability to learn to focus on number is essentially mediated by the acquisition of number symbols. And we have recently got a grant to investigate this longitudinally. So hopefully in a couple of years, I can share some of those results on how exactly, by which mechanism, symbolic number knowledge and the acquisition of symbolic number knowledge changes the way in which children process non-symbolic sets in the world around them. So I just want you to do a small experiment. You can do that in front of your screen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some dot arrays, and you can either say or think as quickly as you can how many dots you see. So 3, 2, 1. So maybe you could take a second to reflect on what you noticed there about this. Hopefully, one of the things that you noticed is that it was much easier for you to name the smaller sets of items. And this is quite a well-documented phenomenon, sometimes referred to as subitizing. We are very fast and accurate for numbers up to 1 and 4. And you can see if you look at the left-hand panel, this is what in Canada we refer to as the hockey stick function, whereby you make almost no errors for sets up to about 4. And then there's a sort of linear increase in the time it takes you to respond, as well as in the errors that you make. And this has led to the suggestion that there are two distinct systems for non-symbolic number processing. On the one hand, the approximate number system that I referred to earlier, which allows us to process large numbers, but we need to do so by approximating, by estimating. And on the other hand, a system that supports the exact enumeration of small sets, which is sometimes being referred to as the process of subitizing, or the object file system, which has sort of a limited capacity of up to 4, but allows for the rapid parallel individuation of up to 4 objects, and therefore that parallel individuation also allows us to label those objects very rapidly. Now, in the context of what I've been talking about, when we consider the relationship between symbolic and non-symbolic number processing, this of course raises the question whether the developmental dynamics depend on the system for numerosity processing. So is it possible that there are differential developmental dynamics when it comes to, on the one hand, large numbers, on the other hand, small numbers? So we already know from the studies that I shared with you just earlier that when it comes to large numbers, it appears to be the case that symbolic scaffolds the acquisition of non-symbolic. But what about small sets? Is there perhaps a different developmental dynamic? Is it bidirectional? Is it unidirectional, but in the other direction? To address this question, some years ago, Jane Hutchison, who was an undergraduate RA in my lab and then went on to complete her PhD dissertation with Ian Lyons at Georgetown, looked back at our Toronto District School Board data from over 500 children. This is the fall and spring data. And she kind of filtered the data as to whether the number pairs that children were seeing contained only numbers in the subitizing range from 1 to 4, or only contained numbers outside of the subitizing range. And then she took the performance data from both small and large symbolic and non-symbolic number processing and essentially reran the cross-leg panel regression models, but separately for small and large. So what did Jane find? Well, first of all, when we just look at the cross-sectional results, we can see, interestingly, that in general, the relationships suggest that there are stronger relationships both in the fall and the spring between symbolic and non-symbolic for small compared to large. But what about the sort of developmental dynamics for both small and large? Well, what we saw here was that when it came to small, we did indeed find evidence for bidirectionality. So you can see that whilst the strongest relationship is still the one going from symbolic to non-symbolic, there is a small but significant a correlation as well, or a regression here from non-symbolic to symbolic. But when it comes to large, we of course replicate the prior results where there is only evidence for a role of symbolic influencing non-symbolic, but not the other way around. So indeed, we do see evidence for slightly differential developmental dynamics when it comes to small and large number processing and the relationships between symbolic and non-symbolic, whereby for large, we see clear evidence that the relationship goes from symbolic to non-symbolic, but for small numbers in the subitizing range, we see evidence for bidirectional relationships. This might have some implications for the way we think about which systems are particularly important early on for grounding numerical symbols. And some have argued that perhaps the object file system is where number symbols initially acquire their meaning, and then via bootstrapping, larger numbers also acquire their meaning. This still remains to be resolved. But when it comes to understanding how these two systems are related, we clearly see that it's important to take into account that both of these systems exist and exhibit slightly different developmental dynamics. So I just want to provide an interim summary before I sort of switch gears a little bit, and I realize that I'm also having to speed up a little bit here with time. So what I've shown you right now, up to now, is that innate skills, such as the approximate number system, do not scaffold symbolic number skills, but rather symbols refine innate systems over developmental time. And we also see evidence for different roles for small and large number processing system within this developmental dynamic between symbolic and non-symbolic. But I want to switch a bit to some practical applications that we've been trying to sort of derive from these more basic science-related questions, which is we've been trying to see how we can use this work to develop screeners to better understand individual differences in foundational competencies in the classroom. And some 10 years ago, together with my then graduate student, Nadia Nosworthy, who's now a professor at Andrews University in Michigan, we designed the so-called numeracy screener, and we put it online for free. And the numeracy screener is a very simple paper and pencil test. You get 1 minute each for crossing out as many of the two larger dot arrays as you see, or crossing out as many of the larger symbolic numbers that you see in these number pairs. And one of the research questions that we've been looking at using this numeracy screener is, does the numeracy screener predict math scores? And we and others have published various papers on this. I'll just share one example here from work by Zach Hawes, who was a grad student in the lab, is now an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And Zach, in this particular study, showed that if you test children in senior kindergarten, so at age 5, and then you look at their math grades in grade 1, you can see that both symbolic and non-symbolic number comparison abilities from a sample of just under 400 children, that both of these are related to the teacher's math grades. Now, math grades are not the best measure. They're very subjective, but nevertheless, we see some moderate relationships here. And interestingly, and this is something that I will discuss in a little bit more detail later, we find, at least in Canadian samples, that symbolic comparison is a unique predictor of math grades over and above all kinds of other variables, such as non-symbolic comparison, number line estimation, arithmetic, and so forth. So symbolic really counts, and this is a story that we've seen unfold in many different papers, not just with the numeracy screener, but in general, when people compare the predictive power of symbolic and non-symbolic, symbolic seems to be a much stronger predictor. We also, this is not a prospective longitudinal study, but sort of looking back using logistic regression models, we've also been able to show that the numeracy screener has a decent level of sensitivity and specificity when it comes to classifying whether a child has developmental dyscalculia or not, but this work needs much more longitudinal work, prospective longitudinal work, rather than sort of retrospective work, but it's at least promising early indication that the screener might be part of a larger battery to capture children who have persistent math learning difficulties. In our work with the screener, we've also worked with educators to try and understand whether this is actually a useful tool for educators. We came up with this in the lab, but is it actually useful? So some years ago, led by Rebecca Merkley, we engaged in a collaboration with the Halton Catholic District School Board near Toronto. And this was a really neat project that Rebecca designed together with Jennifer McDonald, who was at the time the research and assessment manager at the Halton District School Board. And the way that this was built was to have some in-service professional development around early screening. Why would you even do that? Why is that important? Then students would get assessed on the numeracy screener plus some other measures. And then the results would be communicated, and there would be also feedback from the educators, which would then lead to changes in the numeracy screener and so forth. And here's a picture of Rebecca and Jennifer at ARA presenting their work. And this is, for me, a really great example of how you can collaborate with schools to iteratively improve an instrument. And here just a couple of pieces from this particular study, just to show you how educators actually felt about this screener. They felt ready to administrate it. They found it relatively easy to administrate. Students were moderately engaged, so there's still things I think we can do here. And in terms of the usefulness, you can see that most educators found it either very useful or extremely useful, but there's also a substantial group who only indicated that they found it moderately useful and slightly useful. And I think this is incredibly helpful data, because it shows us that we still have a long way to go. And one of the things that educators consistently told us is that they wanted a digital tool, because the scoring was onerous, the page turning was difficult for some of the children. And so we have been busy designing a digital version of the numeracy screener, and we hope to launch this later this year. We will have a couple of sites that will be the pilot sites, and we'll work in the same fashion as sort of pioneered by Rebecca there, working with schools to improve this, to get feedback. But of course, the digital space allows us a lot more flexibility, and it allows a much more accurate scoring, and hopefully also the creation of normed references that can be relatively geographically sensitive. But before I wrap up, I just want to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing, trying to sort of go beyond just studying children in so-called weird societies. Weird, many of you will know what this stands for: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And we know that most developmental and educational psychology research is focused on weird population. And for the most part, generalizability is assumed rather than explicitly tested. We make claims on the basis of our study with children in schools in Canada or in the UK or in the United States, and we assume that the results of those will generalize to other populations, but we rarely test that. And there's a real need to go beyond these weird populations, to be more globally inclusive in our research, and also to better understand variability and the role of context in the kind of psychological work that we do. And with the numeracy screeners, really not necessarily intentionally, but just by putting on a tool on the web for free, you do find that people, there's a huge uptake around the globe. And we sort of, we never ask people to necessarily include us as collaborators, but we ask them to share their experiences with us. And here's some pictures from various contexts: a school in India, in West Africa, and children completing the numeracy screener. And a few years ago, I thought to myself, well, I should get in touch with all of the people who have ever asked me about the numeracy screener, who've used it in different contexts. And so I wrote to lots of people who had used the numeracy screener and asked them, do you want to get together and sort of take all the data we have and just see what's going on with it regards to, context differences, patterns that are universal, and so forth. So Nadir Diaz, a PhD student in the lab, is leading this effort. And what he has sort of collated now is data from over 7,500 children, 26 data sets in 17 countries. And we're sort of using multi-level modeling as well as meta-analytic approaches now to understand how things played out in all of these different contexts. But I just want to share with you some data from West Africa that's sort of left us a little bit puzzled and made us also question some of our assumptions. So some years ago, we had the opportunity, in collaboration with Sharon Wolf, who's doing a lot of work in West Africa, to bring the numeracy screener to Ghana as well as to the Ivory Coast. And I'll report you the data from Ghana first. So in Ghana, we collected data from 372 children. They were between 7 and 9 years old, a little bit difficult to ascertain the age. They were tested on an early grade math assessment, which is a standardized test of math, which is often used in low-income contexts, as well as the numeracy screener, the simple paper and pencil version that just includes symbolic and non-symbolic. And Stephanie Bugden and I analyzed the data. And what we first of all saw was that, yes, when you look at the correlation between the early grade math assessment as an outcome and numeracy screener across both symbolic and non-symbolic, there is a relationship where children who did better on the numeracy screener also did better on the EGMA test. However, when we broke it down into non-symbolic and symbolic, we found something that is opposite to what we've been observing in Canada. We found that the relationship between non-symbolic and EGMA was actually stronger than the relationship between symbolic and EGMA. And these two correlations were significantly different from one another. So this kind of left us puzzled. So we also ran a multiple regression, and we found, contrary to our Canadian data, for example, the data from Zach Horst that I shared with you earlier, that non-symbolic was a significant predictor of math scores, but non-symbolic was not. So these findings run directly counter to our data from Western countries. So we showed this to Sharon and said, is there any chance we can replicate this? Because we can't quite believe it yet. It's so counter to what we previously observed. So she said, yes, I'm going into the neighboring country, the Ivory Coast. We can collect a similarly powered sample size. So we pre-registered our analysis plan to ensure that we would only use the same sort of inclusion and analytical criterion as we did in Ghana. And we collected 355 children from the Ivory Coast, again, between 7 and 9 years old, with the same measures. And again, we found exactly the same thing. Non-symbolic was a significantly stronger predictor of EGMA scores than was symbolic. And this applied, by the way, to all kinds of components of EGMA. So EGMA includes, of course, sort of more fluency questions, more questions related to reasoning. It doesn't matter which components of the EGMA you take, this result turns out to be the case. And as I've already said, this runs counter to the data from Canada, but it also runs counter to a meta-analytic data that's out there. So this is meta-analysis by Michael Schneider showing that if you take, in 2016, he took all of the data that related either symbolic or non-symbolic to math, and he found that symbolic, the meta-analytic estimate was significantly stronger for symbolic related to math than non-symbolic related to math. So this to me really highlights the importance of context. How a number is acquired in different contexts is important, and we need to take that in account and perhaps collaborate more with colleagues in fields such as ethnomathematics. We don't understand the mechanisms that drive this relationship yet because we don't have any observational data other than the screener, but we don't know exactly how children learn math and about number in these contexts. So it's important for us to now conduct additional follow-up studies that explore the role of context. And this might also then lead us to revisiting the directionality in context. So this is from the very beginning of my talk, where I started to explore the relationship between non-symbolic and symbolic number processing, and concluded from our work that at least when it comes to large numbers, the direction is from symbolic to non-symbolic. But of course, now these data from West Africa, for me, raised the question whether context might affect the directionality of the relationship between non-symbolic and symbolic as well. So with that, I'd like to summarize and conclude and leave lots of time for questions. What I've shown you today is that our data, at least from Canadian children, shows that cultural symbolic number development influences pre-existing non-symbolic number processing over the course of learning and development. This developmental dynamic, however, differs as a function of set size, whereby there is a bidirectional relationship for quantities in the subitizing range, but not those outside it. Individual differences in both symbolic and non-symbolic predict math scores, but the relationship is strongest for symbolic in Western samples, and the relationship is strongest for non-symbolic in West African samples. So the context in which we do our work matters, and I think it's useful for all of us, whether we are in educational neuroscience, developmental psychology, or any other field that studies human cognition, human behavior, human brain function, to reflect on the kinds of samples from which we draw our inferences, and how important it is to go beyond sort of maybe our comfort zones, and to consider that contextual variables might be quite different in different contexts and might modulate the relationships that we sometimes assume to be universal, given our own data from the global north. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take as many questions as you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was an amazing talk. I love to see the international perspective there at the end. So if anyone has any questions, can you stick them into the chat, and I will happily put them to Daniel. In the meantime, I guess I get chair's privilege to ask a question. Can I ask, can you speculate what the different context is that would reverse the relative influence of symbolic and non-symbolic skills on maths?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you know, we don't necessarily know how many of these children are in school, what kind of schools they're in, how they're learning about number symbols, whether they're learning about them by rote, therefore not really perhaps making the connections between symbols and quantities. I didn't talk about the overall performance data, but overall performance data is, of course, is quite low in terms of symbolic number processing abilities. I could imagine that there are many more opportunities to engage with non-symbolic quantities, perhaps in informal transactions, helping parents on the farms or in markets. These might all be factors that drive it, the kinds of games that children play that might have you know, engaged them more with these kinds of concrete non-symbolic representations than the symbolic ones. But those are all just speculations, Michael. We need to really investigate this in greater context. We've written up these results, and thankfully through Sharon, we're able to share them with various you know, educators and educational researchers in Ghana and in the Ivory Coast, to have them perhaps give us some comments and some reflections on where we might look next to better understand what's really going on here.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? Here's a good one from someone called Gaia Scarif. Have you heard of that person?
Getting the lab back together, Michael.
So Guy says, hello, Daniel, amazing talk. 2 questions. The first one, I love the focus on number learning in Ghana and a focus on ethnomathematics. Totally endorse that we need to understand context. Could you tell us more about how EGMA works too? Or was this measure consistent across the studies on the global north?
Yeah, thanks, Gaia, for that question. With the EGMA, we've been wondering about this too, because we don't, of course, have EGMA data with Canadian kids. But one of the things we did do, so most of the studies that people have done in Canada, or the studies that are included in Michael Schneider's meta-analysis, most of them include arithmetic, some version of math fluency calculation test. So when you only take the items from the EGMA that are arithmetic, the results hold. So ideally, I would have liked to have done a study in Canada with the EGMA, but I'm not sure it's really worth the investment, given that, you know, you already see that when we just take the arithmetic items from the EGMA, the same results hold. And it's a valid, reliable measure that is similar to the ones used in Western context. But eventually, once we do another study here in Canada, I will include the EGMA just to double check. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Another question here from Paul Winter. He says, thank you for an interesting talk. Daniel mentioned that it is easy for young children to recognize dots up to 4. Isn't it the case that those who play board games with dice are easily able to recognize up to 6 dots? So yeah. Is subitization open to cultural influences?
Only if you, so of course, with dots, you learn the canonical arrangements of the array. So they essentially become symbolic. So you can do that, but if I showed, even if you played a lot of board games with a 6-face die, if I show you canonical arrangements of 5 and 6, you're still going to be slower than non-canonical, so random arrangements, than the particular pattern that are shown on the die face. So I don't think it's quite the same as subitizing. I think subitizing is, some people argue that it's sort of a quirk of our visual system, that our visual system has a capacity limit for the parallel processing of non-symbolic numbers that's around 3 or 4. And beyond that, we need to engage in serial shifts of attention. But die patterns are very special in that they're these highly overlearned configurations of dots that we've mapped onto symbols. And therefore, it looks like subitizing, but I don't think it's the same cognitive process.
Great, thanks. Got some more questions. Here's one from Chris Eccles. He said, did any of these studies, especially those in non-weird countries, include literacy assessments or the recognition of letters?
Yes, I do believe we have an EGMA language assessment in there too. And I believe I would have to double check that we include that into our analyses. But we did not have an independent literacy measure in this study. It was literally that we had the opportunity, Sharon Wolf was conducting a much larger intervention study in Ghana and happened to offer to us that we could include the numeracy screener in her study design, but we didn't have an independent measure of literacy. Yeah.
Great. Sue Gifford says, I wonder about the relevance of Therese Bucina's work about children's interpretation of numerals in everyday life in the UK. That's a 2023 paper, Daniel, so I don't know whether you've necessarily seen it.
I have not read that. So thank you, Sue. Let me just get this link because I'll look at it, but I can't really answer your question because I don't.
I'll just tell you what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
I just wonder about the individual variation because you've averaged all the children, haven't you? And so even within a culture, such as it is, multi-ethnic culture that we have in Britain, what Harris has found is that children interpret numerals in different ways, like and we haven't really asked them what sense they are making of the numerals that they see. So they may see a 6 on a packet of crisps and think that only 6-year-olds can eat those crisps because they're used to interpreting the numbers in the labels in their clothes as age related. And so I just think that there's very interesting research going on there about, well, what sense do children make of number symbols? And age is quite a significant thing in our culture. Whereas you're looking at cardinal meanings for numerals, aren't you?
That's right. Yeah.
And really there's a plethora, isn't there, of meanings that children are exposed to, as we know. So
absolutely. Yeah, I this is a really great point, Sue. And I completely agree with you that, the numeracy screener only captures a very narrow dimension of how numerals may be processed. And we've looked at other things, and many people on this call have looked at things such as ordering and naming and using numerals as labels, house numbers, and so forth. So yes, absolutely. I think this is in fact critical. I think in the early years education is to have children be exposed to these multiple uses of numerals so that they can develop these really flexible representations. That was what was at the heart of the program is called Number Worlds. It was developed here in Canada, and I forget the name of the person at OISE who developed it. But the idea of Number Worlds was sort of to have children move through different worlds in which numbers are used differently, so that they can build this what was then referred to as a central conceptual structure of symbolic number. So, yeah, that would be important to include that in the sort of more cross-national or maybe qualitative analysis of individual differences as well.
Yeah. You may not have to go to Ghana to find different cultural interpretations.
That is very true.
Thank you. Thank you. Great talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue.
Super. Gaia has come back with another question. She wants to know more about how's it going to work with the bidirectionality between symbolic and non-symbolic in the small number range, but unidirectional in the higher number range. How might that work?
Can you say a little bit more?
And have I got it right? So I'm intrigued because the small range is within limits of visual, spatial, attentional skills. So I'm less interested in subitizing per se and more the attentional demands of what might be going on in the context of the small range versus the large range. So I'm interested in the findings, but also in your speculation about the mechanisms. You know, why would it be that that below those limits, the relationships are bidirectional, whereas beyond that limit, it's symbolic that wins. And have I got it right?
Yeah, you do.
Is it unidirectional? Okay, good.
You do. You do. So it was bidirectional for subitizing. It was unidirectional out of subitizing range. That's what Jane reported. I guess it's that subitizing allows you for an exact representation of numerosity, which is much more close to the symbolic verbal representation.
So exact, it's something about developing an exact representation, then maybe that is feasible.
Exactly. Whilst I think in my estimation, I don't have direct evidence for this, the approximate number system is never really connected to the symbolic number system because it is in its form, in its representational structure, so different from the exact symbolic representation that the only thing that happens is that once you acquire it, it may serve as an attentional filter, or there may be multiple possibilities by which it then goes on to influence non-symbolic systems.
So it allows for refining your performance with those stimuli then, but they're actually quite different systems to begin. And at that point with the large range, that difference is magnified. Where in the interesting. Sorry, thank you. So I was intrigued to hear you to tell us more about why.
I think it's because of the similarity in the underlying structure, in what it represents, and that breaks apart once you get beyond the subitizing or object file range.
Thank you.
Excellent. A question from Jesucio, who says, "Thank you very much for this interesting talk. My understanding is that addition problems were used as a measure of math achievement, referring to the Lau's paper. I'm wondering if any other measures of math achievement have been used, for example, math reasoning."
That's a great question. I mean, predominantly, if you look at the meta-analysis, it does seem to be that our field is a bit obsessed with arithmetic, and particularly arithmetic fluency. So a lot of the outcome measures have been there. So there's space for exploring these relationships with other measures of math. I mean, in the UK, you call maths, plural. Here in North America, we have it singular, but I think the plural is more apt. And so, there's room. I'm sure other people have looked at symbolic, non-symbolic as it relates to math reasoning, but predominantly people have used simple arithmetic. So there is room here to have a better representation of maths in the dependent variables, for sure.
Would you speculate if you measured spatial maths to do with like geometry and so forth that is more visuospatially based, you might get closer associations to non-symbolic?
Actually, you don't. So Zach Hawes, for his PhD in the lab, looked at this, and he found that with things such as mental rotation, the relationship is also stronger for symbolic and mental rotation rather than non-symbolic. I do think this is going a bit off this particular question, but we also have to think about the measurement. I think the non-symbolic measurement is a real concern. We have a paper that we just submitted where Nathan Lau, postdoc in the lab, who was involved with the earlier work, took a lot of the existing dot comparison tasks and sort of ran a structural equation modeling. 500 people did all of these 7 different variants of this task, most commonly used task. And what we report is that there is a correlated factors model, but there is no ANSG, if you like, So these tasks just don't hang together coherently. So I think, and Gaia, in the work we did together with the preschool children, we also found that non-symbolic tasks was sort of an outlier, right? So there is a measurement issue here as well with these tasks that I think we have to address. It's boring, but we have to address it if we're going to continue to do this individual differences work.
Super. We are almost out of time, but I get to squeeze in one more question.
Of course you do.
Cheers, privilege. So
for everybody, this is what my PhD was like. Michael asking me very hard questions during lab meetings. Go ahead.
I'd say, yes. I'm interested in the translational part, so that the teachers have now improved your numeracy screener, and so it's on a phone and it all works great. Have you any sense about what they're using it for? If they identify kids on it, what they've been able to do as a consequence, what interventions it might have triggered them to use to address the particular skills that the numeracy screener is picking up?
Yeah, so this is something we need to get much better at. But we've done it sort of in stops and starts, but not systematically. With Toronto, we really did, we did the professional development to tell them what the screeners can and cannot do, because we didn't want them to go away and label kids as dyscalculic at age 5 on the basis of a 2-minute test. And we also didn't want them to sort of overestimate what they could infer. But in the Toronto study, we actually then, after they administered the screener, we evaluated the results and we gave each teacher a sheet that told them how each student performed and what some of the next steps might be. But we haven't sort of gone in depth to then follow up whether the screening actually led to tangible consequences in the long run. That's something that we would like to do. And we're working on that with some partners here, with local partners, but also partners in New Brunswick, to try and see whether we can do something more extensive like that. And I know that Joanne Lefebvre, Stephanie Bogdan, and others also are doing very similar work around that, because there is now a greater push. I don't know how it is in the UK, but at least in Canada, there seems to be greater push to sort of have more early screening for number, just like we do have early screening for phonics and so forth. So I think the time now is ripe to do that kind of work, but to do it carefully and to really think about next steps and not misinterpretation of the data either. So needs careful handling.
Super. Well, thanks so much, Daniel. It's been a fascinating talk and superb insight into your work and answers to all the tough questions we've thrown at you. So many thanks, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'll hope you'll join us again at the next CEN seminar. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day, everyone. Nice to see you, Michael. Let's catch up again soon.
Pleasure.